Thanks to all of you for joining the workshop. I'm pretty excited that you're interested. The way that we'll do this is I will speak, I'll go through my material for about the first 45 minutes, and then we'll leave the final 15 minutes for any questions that anybody has, so we can address them then, and that'll keep the whole thing moving along. So please remember to keep your microphones on mute until we open it up to questions. I'd really appreciate that. So thanks to Kat and Tony at the Film Co-op for putting this together and hosting the workshop series. I'm pretty excited to be part of it. So I'll give you a bit of information about myself. My name's Alex Vietinghoff. I'm from Fredericton originally, and it's where I still live today. I studied at St. Thomas University. I did a major in journalism there. And after that, I've worked a whole bunch of different jobs all over the place in Fredericton anyway. And some of those jobs were, for example, CBC, CBC New Brunswick. I worked for them for a while, different video production companies in town, freelancing, and I still freelance today for different companies or documentaries that are being filmed around New Brunswick or the East Coast. And I've done some of my own stuff, so short documentaries for film festivals and TV, and even a feature-length independent documentary with my wife. And so currently what I do is 3 days a week, I work part-time for Horizon Health in the communications department doing video for them. And the rest of the time is all freelance. So it's a nice balance that I've hit where I have a little bit of a guaranteed income and then the variety from freelance the rest of the time. And my most recent project is just went up yesterday. It's a TV show for Bell's TV1 called Maritime Spirits, and it's a show where each episode profiles a different craft alcohol producer across the Canadian Maritimes. So that's the latest thing that I'm pretty pumped about. So the stuff that we're going to cover today, I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground, and then if you have any questions, maybe write them down so you keep them and remember them for the end, and then I'll answer whatever questions you have. We're going to talk about how to find an interesting story, how to find interesting people and interview subjects, how to prepare for making a documentary, so writing a script of sorts, even before you're doing any interviewing, and we'll get into why you'd be doing script writing for a documentary, which might be unscripted by its very nature. We'll be talking a bit about bias and how you approach being biased or unbiased when you're making a documentary, how to film your doc from the production and logistics perspective, how to interview people, talk about a bit about cameras and style and gathering B-roll, organizing your footage and your research and editing it all. And finally, we'll even talk a bit about pitching your documentary project to potential broadcasters or networks or people who might want to pay for it, which is the goal for a lot of people. So first off, we'll get into story. So the first step when you're going to make a documentary is that you identify what it's going to be about. So is it going to be an educational piece, or is the intent to profile a specific person, an interesting character, or to talk about a specific issue? So I think most people would know right off the bat that they've got a subject or a topic in mind, so that's the easy part. But if you want people to be able to, or to want to watch your documentary and to pay attention, you need to make sure that it's made interesting. Even if it's very interesting to you, you'll still need to approach it in a way so that it's interesting to other people and other viewers. And so most of the time, even if you're covering a large topic, the thing that people will really relate to that'll draw them in is having interesting characters that the viewer can either relate to, or maybe they want to follow their journey or see what's going on. So usually identifying your key people long before you film is important. And as I'll talk about later, when you are going to try to pitch a doc project, most of the time they want you to already have identified your interview subjects or the subjects of your doc. So the biggest thing that my wife and I learned when we made our independent feature doc, which was called Bureaucracy, was that you should never go into a documentary hoping to find a story after the fact, which is what we did. We were like, we're going to do a documentary about the growing craft beer industry in New Brunswick. And because it was like at the time that it was really starting to boom, and we're like, we'll find a cool story within that, but that's like our angle. And we ended up interviewing maybe like 21 to 25 people, which is a lot of people to interview. We did find a cool story angle, but it's not a guarantee that that will happen. And you waste a lot of time going through, trying to edit and find a story, or asking people irrelevant questions. And if you basically, you really want to have that story idea in mind before you start filming, because it'll shape the interview questions, it'll shape the types of footage that you gather, and it'll make your whole production a lot easier and smoother. And it's no guarantee, if you're going in hoping to find a story, there's not a guarantee that you will just magically find something interesting. So you do want to try to identify it ahead of time. So the way that you do that is before you do the interviews, while you're developing your idea, you're going to actually want to write out an outline, even though you don't know if it's going to be exactly how it's going to go or not. So you write out an outline of how you think the film will go, just like you would if you were writing a scripted film that with actors and that kind of thing. So you write out how you think the film's going to go. You can fill in any interview parts with what you think the subjects might say. It might not be the exact same, but it'll really help craft your overall vision, and it'll help come up with proper interview questions to kind of get them to speak about the story points that you want to hit. You don't want to risk not doing that, because you might have like a story that's not cohesive, or just a whole doc that isn't very cohesive, and it ends up being like a bunch of mini profiles of different people, and there's not like one overall storyline or plot that's moving forward. And so that's kind of I feel that's kind of a bit what happened with our doc bureaucracy, but we did end up finding a story within it. So when we're talking about subjects, most documentaries have at least one person in them that the viewers are following, whether it's the main character and we're following their personal journey, or whether it's an expert talking about a topic, or the people that are impacted by something going on and talking about their opinions or their personal experiences. And in some cases, in some types of documentaries, it could even be the filmmaker themselves, like Morgan, I forget his last name, Spillman maybe, who did like the Super Size Me movies. So he makes himself the main character of his docs. And if you're an interesting enough person, then that can work for you. So as I said, you want to identify what that angle is going to be before you start filming. Because they're going to either be the ones propelling the story forward, or they themselves are the story. And so at one point we were pitching a doc project to CBC, and they'd approved our entire idea for what it was going to be about and what our idea for what the story was going to be. But because we were waiting to get approval before we were finding interview subjects, and they basically like, we approve everything, but we're not going to sign a contract until you tell us exactly who the interview subjects are and confirm that they're going to be a part of it. So you really, like, if you're hoping to sell and pitch your doc or get funding before you make it, people are going to need to know that you already have identified a subject. So ideally, you'd like your subject to be someone who's good on camera. And if they aren't, because not everybody is comfortable being on camera, your job as an interviewer or as a director is to make them feel comfortable on camera, just like you would if you were directing actors in a short film or a feature film. And so one trick that I've learned to get people comfortable with the camera, if they're not the types that like being filmed or they're intimidated by seeing lights and cameras, is that when you show up to the area that you're going to film them and they're there with you, the first thing you do is set up the cameras and the lights. And then after that's set up, or while you're setting it up, you can just kind of shoot the breeze with the interview subject and talk with them a bit, and you're getting them kind of comfortable with you, but you're also getting them used to seeing the camera equipment and all the gear. So it's going to be a bit less intimidating for them. And then once you're kind of like having a normal conversation, you can be like, all right, well, we might as well start filming now if you're ready. And I find that works a lot better, instead of just showing up being like, all right, here we go, set up the gear and start right away. It's a good, and even if it's like, it doesn't matter who the subject is, if it's someone that you want them to be the main subject and they're the hero of the story, or if they're even the villain of the story in some cases, you still want them to feel comfortable on camera, because you want to get the most honest answers that you can from them. So another trick, and this depends on the style of filming that you do, but for mine, I prefer to have the subject looking at the interviewer slightly off camera, not looking into the camera. And that's up to your personal preferences. But I also find that helps with the subject feeling more comfortable, because I remind them, don't look into the camera at all, just look at me like we're just having a normal conversation. And I usually film with more than one camera. So I tell them, if you jumble up your answer or sentence, you can stop and restart what you're saying, no worries at all. And having more than one camera allows you in the edit to cut and disguise any flubs that someone might make. So it helps you in that regard. So another thing, this is common sense, but you want to be polite and respectful to your subjects, even if it's like an evil CEO of a corporation or something like that. You want to get the most honest answers that you can, and just get them to feel comfortable, and not feeling bad after the interview, like they're going to have to chase you down and be like, please don't use this, or I don't know what this was. So no matter who it is, treat them with respect and politeness, and everyone will feel good about it, hopefully. So in that regard, you want to also always make sure your subjects sign a release or a waiver for appearing in the documentary. And you can find free templates for that online anywhere. And you just want to update the wording so it's about you and your company name or the documentary name. And this will protect you legally in case the person down the road decides that they didn't want to be part of it after all. You've got your proof that they signed a waiver, so it's too bad you agreed to it. And there's a lot of broadcasters, if they're going to be licensing your documentary, they require that you have had all the subjects sign a waiver before they'll agree to license your work. So it helps you in that regard as well. So I will talk a bit about bias and how to approach your own personal biases or when you're going to be documentary filmmaking. So if you want the viewer to trust you and trust your documentary and the message that you're conveying, you need to be honest about any bias and try your best to be unbiased in your documentary storytelling. And I tend to approach documentaries from my background in journalism, and I try to basically be as unbiased as I can, a presenter of information, and allow the viewer to make their decisions for themselves. So that means trying to make an effort to tell both sides of any story. And viewers generally don't want to be told, no one likes feeling like they're being told what to think. So this will help a lot in just getting the viewers intrigued, making their own decisions based on the information that you're providing them. So like I said, to try to remain unbiased, it's important to try to get both sides of any story, or if you're pushing some specific message, interviewing people who have the opposite opinion as you or the main subjects to see what they have to say. Maybe they've got some valid information, but it's important to allow the viewer to make these decisions for themselves. Worst case scenario, you've covered your bases by asking someone with the opposite opinion, and maybe you've given your story an interesting antagonist, or maybe even some comedic relief. So you're not going to lose out by doing that. So let's talk a bit about the production and logistics aspects. So let's assume you've got your draft script written out. All of your subjects have agreed to a time and place to be filmed. You've got your waivers that they're going to be signing. If you're filming in a very specific location, like someone's business, you might want to bring a waiver, a location release form, just as you would for a film, in case the location or the business down the road changes their mind, or something along those lines. So make sure that you show up on time, and usually you want to have informed the person that you're going to need at least 1 hour of their time booked off. That's because you need to set up the gear, interview them, tear down the gear, but you also need to film B-roll, which is basically a term that we use for the footage that you're showing, like background footage. So it's when you hear someone talking and we cut away to other shots and the person's still talking, that's B-roll. And basically you want to get this footage to help tell the story, but also to keep the viewer interested in looking at the screen, because if we're just staring at someone talking forever and ever, we might start to get bored and our eyes are going to drift around the screen and think about other stuff. So you want to get as much B-roll as you can that's relevant to keep the viewer interested and to also just help you disguise any edits or cuts that you might need to make. You'll want to make sure that you have a very good audio solution. You'll probably heard this in other workshops, and it's totally true, but audio quality is even more important than video quality. And it's evident when you listen to a podcast or a radio doc while you're driving or doing whatever. It's easy to focus and interesting. But then if you're watching a video and it's terrible audio, like cell phone quality or wind, it's really hard to watch a video like that. So that's why it's really important to have good audio. On our shoots, we usually keep it very small crew, like usually just my wife and I, to keep our budgets low. So we don't usually hire a separate sound recorder or sound operator, but we have all of our own equipment. So I usually have at least two things recording audio. I've got either the boom microphone above the interview subject or lav mic, and then on one of my B cameras, my extra cameras, I have a shotgun microphone as a backup in case for whatever reason the main audio didn't work. I know at the very least, if it's not fantastic, I'll still be able to use a clip of the person talking, and it's saved me before. So I highly recommend you use at least two things that are recording audio, even if they're both into your cameras, even if it's just having your phone with an audio recorder app, hit record when you do the interview while you're recording with your cameras, and then you have a backup that you can sync up later if you need to. And as I said, so we use multiple cameras. I like the angle of having like at least 2 or 3 different cameras filming the person being interviewed, and you can cut between them. It makes it more interesting. You can show the person on screen for longer because we're showing the viewer a different image, so it keeps them more interested, and it helps you cover up any cuts, or if someone's saying their ums and ahs and they're super long and you want to remove them, you can kind of disguise those, and it gives you a backup as well in case one of the cameras goes kaput. And those backups are important because with documentaries, you don't always get a second chance to film material you lost. Like with a short film or another film, you can wrangle all the actors and crew again and go reshoot it. But with a documentary, when you're talking to people and getting authentic, raw answers, you're never going to be able to get the same thing twice from someone. So it's important to have some backup solutions. And it doesn't need to be a super fancy camera. You can even use your phone. Our phones these days take amazing quality footage, and you can use a second phone if you've just got yours, you can borrow a friend's, or use one phone for the video, another phone, like I mentioned, for just the audio recorder. You can disguise that phone either on the table in front of the subject or get them to have it in their shirt pocket and get some pretty clear audio that way, and then just sync it up in the edit. So another thing you want to be conscious of when you're filming these interviews is your camera angle and your lighting. In films, as you guys know, we use those tools to convey specific moods and or certain emotions and shots. And in a documentary, if you are trying to take a journalistic approach, as I mentioned earlier, then you do actually want to make sure that you're using a more neutral camera angle and look. And so for a neutral camera angle, this means that usually you'd be keeping the camera at eye level with the subject. Your lighting would be fairly neutral, because like if you've got the camera kind of lower than the person looking up, and they're looking down, you're conveying a sense of that they're in a kind of a sense of power. Or if the camera's very high and the person's looking up, you're kind of conveying a sense of weakness, or the person's small. Same thing with lighting. If you're lighting kind of down facing up, and you're getting that scary Halloween horror movie lighting, or you don't want the light deer and headlights look that's straight on. So I usually try to do a standard 3 light setup of like a light 45 degrees and just a nice neutral look. And that way I know I'm not trying to tell the viewer that this person is being presented in any specific way, and it's fairly neutral. But you still obviously want to make it look good, and you can do that with making the lighting in the background interesting, or using some colored LEDs and that kind of thing. Just keep in mind that when you're showing someone on camera, the way that you show them is going to be telling the viewer how to feel, whether subconsciously or not. And so as I mentioned, using B-roll to cut away, I'll mention a rule that I was taught when I went to the journalism school, which was that on average, a person, when they're watching something, can only look at a shot for 3 seconds before they get bored. If it's like a shot of like nature or a car or whatever it is, if it's a shot of a person, then they can look at it for 10 seconds before they get bored. So usually when I'm editing my videos, I've got the person's on camera talking. I try to keep it to around 10 seconds at most before I cut back to B-roll. And I find over the years, since I've learned that people's attention span has gotten even shorter and smaller. So I tend to make cuts even quicker than that. But that's part of why filming an interview with multiple cameras will help you, because you can keep the person on screen while cutting to different angles, and you're still keeping the viewer interested that way. So you do need to make sure that you get lots and lots of B-roll, and it's better to be safe than sorry. As we learned with the show that I was just talking about earlier, Maritime Spirits, each of these shoots at each brewery, we spent about 4 hours there. So we'd interview 2 people and film a bunch of footage, and these are 10-minute episodes. And I found in most of them, we still didn't have quite enough B-roll. So I ended up, usually I was able to contact the person and ask if they had any videos they could send or photos, but you kind of hate to have to do that. And you ideally want to get all of the footage yourself. So with gathering B-roll, you want action shots, you want close-ups of the person doing whatever it is they do, whether it's their job or their hobby, or showing you something, or if they're reenacting whatever it is that they're talking about. And this is where with B-roll, you don't need to necessarily be neutral with your camera angles as you would in an interview. You can really kind of delve more into the filmmaking and cinematography aspects and get creative. So that's the part where you don't need to necessarily strictly try to be completely neutral for the viewer. So usually I will interview, this is up to personal preference, but I always interview my subjects before gathering B-roll. And the reason I do this is because when you're asking to use someone's time, they might get fed up with you if you start going over the time that you've told them it's going to be. So I'll do the interview first to make sure we've got that out of the way, because you need the interview to have your story. And then basically film B-roll after that as long as they will let me do so. And this way, if you filmed all your B-roll first and then you're like, okay, now we're going to do the interview, you're not going to be told by the person like, oh, I've only got 15 minutes and I've got to go back to work or something like that. So filming the interview first for me is my safety net. So I know I've always got that. That's up to personal preference, but that's something in my experience that has helped out. Another thing, and when you're filming and interviewing people, it's important to try like editing in your mind. So what that means is while you're filming and interviewing someone, if they're giving you any really good quotes or stories, make a mental note of that and what they said, or if you've got a pen and paper, maybe write it down. I've seen some directors that will wave in front of the camera, so they're making a little visual note to the editor or to themselves later when they're scrubbing through and they see the wave, they're like, okay, I know this was like an amazing quote that was just said, or something that we really want to use. Let's talk a bit about editing. So once you put all the footage on your computer, I highly recommend that you rename and label all of your clips and files. So even if it's something simple as like the interview subject's name, like Alex, camera A, something like that. Or for the B-roll, you're saying like walking to work, medium shot, or making coffee, close up or something. This will really help you. Documentaries, I find they take longer to edit than a short film. And so if it takes longer, you're not necessarily going to remember what each shot was if the file's named like 321_MOV or something like that. So naming it and keeping it organized will really help you edit, because you want to be able to just be as efficient as possible and spend as much energy and time just crafting the story and doing a good job, not looking for random files or rewatching all of your clips. It also really helps, and I learned this the hard way, that after you do your interviews that same day or very shortly after, go through the interview footage on your computer or your editing software and pick out your best clips and best quotes while they're fresh in your mind. When we did Bureaucracy, we had some interviews that were way too long. Like some interview subjects spoke to us for 50 minutes. And we waited forever to go back and edit all this stuff. And by the time we went back, we couldn't remember where the good quotes were or not. So we had to basically sit through these 50-minute interviews again and again to try to find stuff, and used up so much time where we could have been moving along and doing more. So doing it as soon as you can will really help you in the long run. And it'll keep you motivated and keep the project moving along. And so as you're editing and you're laying down your interviews, maybe your narration that's telling a story, make sure that every now and then you leave some breathing room so that the viewer can absorb what was just said. And sometimes I'm guilty of not leaving enough breathing room because I do a lot of corporate video and I'm used to trying to cram as much information as I can into a short amount of time. But with documentaries, you don't need to cram as much information. You are making a film and you want it to be a pleasant experience and for stuff to sit with someone. So after a very powerful statement or emotional statement's made, maybe you want to allow the music to swell up, or let's maybe allow the sounds of whatever B-roll it is that you're showing to swell up, and it gives a few seconds for the viewer to absorb what's going on. Or maybe if there was a very emotional scene, it can kind of give them a second to take a breath and get ready for the story to move along. I'm going to talk a bit about the pitching your doc aspect. So I guess the goal for most of us when we make any video or documentary, whatever it is, we want as many people as possible to watch our documentary. So if you don't care about making money on it, that's perfectly fine. All the power to you. You can just put it up on YouTube and Facebook and such. But if you want a broadcaster to license it, or a network, there's certain things that you should know. So first of all, if you want a broadcaster or network to license it, don't put it up for free on YouTube or Facebook, because they're not going to want it, because anyone can go watch it for free. It's the same with a lot of film festivals. Like, they wouldn't want to accept a piece that anyone could go watch for free, because then they're not going to go to that platform to watch it. So keep it, even though it's painful and hard to do sometimes, keep it set to a private Vimeo link or something like that for a while. But I found that most major broadcasters like CBC and CTV and all of them, they want to be involved in the documentary process from the very beginning. So it can be harder if you've already made it and then you're trying to shop it out after the fact. With a lot of the big broadcasters, they want to be involved in the entire thing. And it's actually unlikely that someone like CBC would just license your doc if you went out and made it and they had nothing to do with it. But it is possible, and it's been done before. But this is partially due to the broadcasters' policies on their journalism standards. So I said I worked at CBC. They've got very specific journalism ethics and practices standards. And so if they're going to be, that's for any material that's documentary or newsy in nature going up that's associated with their name. So they need to know, or they want to know, that if you're making a documentary, you are following their specific ethics and practices. And that's why first, if you're hoping CBC or CTV, if it's a very newsy, informative documentary, you might want to pitch the idea to them before just going out and making it, because if they agree to do it, you'll get some great money, but they will also be wanting to guide you along in the process, and you'd be in contact with them and they're making sure that you're following their practices. The minor painful thing about that, of course, though, if you're involving other people, is that you don't necessarily get complete creative freedom, because they might have edits of their own that they want to make. So that's stuff that I've run into before, where we got CBC on some short docs to fund us, and it was projects we pitched ahead of time. And then the editing process took way longer than it would normally take us, because they kept having changes. But that's the nature of how it is when you're working with clients or you're being paid for your work. Just keep that in mind, that if you're hoping to get money for your doc, you'll be able to get more if you pitch to a broadcaster before making it, but it's also easier to just go out and make it and then try to shop it around after the fact. You just might not get as much money for it, if that's what you're after. There are other avenues, though, to make your film and find an audience after. So that's what we did with Bureaucracy. We actually did an Indiegogo campaign to raise $10,000 to make it. So it's actually, that might sound like a lot of money, but for filmmaking for, especially for a feature length project, that's a very micro budget. If I think actually it qualifies as no budget. So most of the money went into gas to drive around and film, and occasionally hotels when needed, and then submitting it to festivals and all that stuff. But we were able to license Bureaucracy after we made it to, we put it on Amazon Prime Video and Vimeo on demand. So people still rent it there like every week. In this documentary, we made it in like 2016 or 2017, and it still get a few bucks every week from on-demand views, which is nice. Not a lot of money, like literally $5 every week, but it's still cool. And Bell TV One licensed it, which was awesome because they licensed it. It was like 3 years, I think. And so after we made the doc, and we didn't make any money on it because we used all the money we raised for all the expenses, then Bell licensed it for like $3,000. So that was like, oh, we actually got to make a bit of money off it after the fact, which isn't a lot of money. Like if any of you are licensing docs, you should ask for way more than that. But for a basically no budget project, we were pretty happy to just get it up on TV and get a bit of money for it. And so you don't have to go the traditional old broadcaster route. You can go online and even approach specific networks, like depending on what it's about, if it's a lifestyle or food or sports or whatever the topic is, and you could be approaching people directly to try to license it or see if they would sponsor it or something like that. It helps to have the funding beforehand, but I think the most important thing is just going out and making it. I spoke a lot faster than I intended, so I'm ready to take on any questions now, if anyone has any.
I have a question.
Sure.
How do you go about landing, say, the villain? If you're making a documentary like that does vilify them or the place they work or something, how do you convince them to take part, or do you kind of play it like it's something else, until you get your quotes?
That's an awesome question, because that's like one of the really hard parts about how to do it. And there's a lot of different ways. The first approach that I would recommend is you contact them and say, hi, I'm so-and-so, I'm making a documentary about this topic, and I would love to interview you to get your thoughts on it, or based on your role or your company, I'd love to hear what your thoughts are on it. If they say no, which if they know that they're widely hated for whatever the topic is, like an environmental cause, chances are they would say no. Then you can, one thing that people like, so when I worked at CBC and even just like with daily news reporting, if there's a story about, I'll use NB Power as an example. I don't have anything against NB Power. Let's say there's a story about NB Power is raising their rates a whole bunch, and you want to interview the CEO about why this is happening. So you've got your interview subjects that are affected by it, and maybe they're like, we can't afford to pay these rates. Then you could, and the CEO says, no, I don't want to be a part of your documentary. Then you can say, well, look, we interviewed people and they were specifically saying that NB Power is like ruining their lives and that kind of thing. We want to give you the opportunity to defend yourself against these claims. So you're giving them the chance to kind of give their perspective. So that's usually the second route that you take. Third, there's other ways to do it. And so we had to rely on one of these, which was when we did Bureaucracy, the story that we found that evolved from it was all the brewers were like, we're trying to grow and hire as much people and grow our business, but NB Liquor is preventing us from growing because they've got all these crazy old archaic liquor laws that they won't update, and they don't want to like promote our local product. And there's all this different stuff about NB Liquor. And so we were like, well, we have to interview NB Liquor because we need to get their perspective so that we're being unbiased. And NB Liquor did not want to be a part of it at all. And so we emailed them a lot. We called them a few times to try to convince them they weren't going to be a part of it. And eventually, so this is up to your own personal morals. But in Canada, legally, you're allowed to record any conversation with only one party consenting to being recorded. In the States, you have to have both people in the know, but in Canada, you don't. You can record anything because you, the person recording, are the the one party who's consented to being recorded. And if someone's speaking to a journalist or a documentary filmmaker, this is my own way of arguing it to myself, is that they should know that whatever they say is probably going to be used in some regards. So I just recorded one of the phone calls with the NB Liquor Communications guy, because he was kind of known as a character, and he was ranting about, I don't know, he hates journalists, he hates documentary films, whatever. I forget the exact things that he was going on about, but it was just kind of like talking about how he didn't want to be part of the documentary. And you hear my voice in the call too, being like, well, we're trying to include you. And it was just like, is a way of like, we're going to include you no matter what. And if you don't want to be part of it, then we'll include you saying you don't want to be part of it. So the viewer's not asking like, well, that's not fair. Why didn't you ask NB Liquor's stance on it? So that's another option. And there's always like the Michael Moore option of running in with your cameras and demanding quotes from the person. But I would recommend that as a last resort, because chances are security will kick you out, or the cops or something like that. And it probably won't work out unless you're super famous. I would recommend the first two, which is just politely ask the person. If they say no, tell them this is your chance to defend yourself or to control your own messaging of how you come across by talking to us. And whatever you do not promise them that you will let them watch it before it's done, because I guarantee, even if it's like someone that looked good in the documentary, no one ever likes how they look on camera. They never come across the way they think in their head. So they're always going to be like, oh, can you change that? Or they'll be, I demand you change that. And that's not a fun position to be put in. So don't commit to letting people watch it before it's done, because it'll just be a pain down the road. Yeah, but thanks for that question. It's a fun one, and it's a tricky one for sure. Any other questions?
I have another one.
Sure. Yeah.
Do you find, like, say it's not like a sit down interview, say you're being, a tour of one of the breweries or something. Do you find it's easier to film with cameras that are like smaller, like more run and gun, just because it's like, it's less of a big deal, and people see big cameras, they get weird. You know what I mean?
Yeah, totally. That's a really good question, because I've had that work in both ways before. There's been situations like our camera gear is that we have one big cinema camera, and that looks like a news camera. Like if you're downtown with it, someone comes up and like, are you with the news? And then we have our like DSLR size mirrorless camera. And I even have an even smaller point and shoot. They're all Sony's, so they all have the same color profile, so I can match all the footage, which is great. There's been instances where having the big camera legitimized us, because someone might be like, are these just like some student filmmakers or something? Don't take them seriously. But then having the big camera, security will just come over and open the door for me, because they assume I'm with the news, which everyone just cooperates with for the most part. So having the big camera has helped in some regards. Maybe if you want to be coming across as like a serious kind of production, that maybe if you think that'll help you getting certain answers or interviews or access, that can help you. In other instances, it does help to just be using your small cameras, because you just kind of want to not necessarily be under the radar, like you're not trying to hide the camera or anything, but you want people to feel more comfortable, like, oh, it's just like someone's film, like they're not thinking that this is like, it's not like it's the news here trying to get some scoop on us or anything. So it can help in both ways, and I think it's kind of up to you to make the judgment call depending on what you feel you need to do in any situation. But on all of our shoots, we've usually got these 2 or 3 cameras with us and going all over the place. And I will say though that the smaller cameras certainly help when gathering B-roll to get more footage and move around a lot faster, because lugging the big cinema camera and the tripod around, especially in the summer, even in like hot breweries, it's really tiresome. And sometimes I'm so tired that I'm like, I'm too lazy to get any more footage. And luckily my wife will be using the smaller camera and get more footage. But this summer, I'm like, if we're filming another season or more docs, I'm going to get some other rig set up so I'm not hampered by the weight of the tripod, and that's not preventing me. I saw a question pop up in the chat. What's my editing process like? So what I do is I dump all the footage on the computer. I organize it and label it, as I mentioned. Then I open up my editing program of choice, whether it's Adobe Premiere, which is what I use most of the time. I used to use Avid Media Composer a lot. Then what I like to do is I lay the interview out, or the interviews on their own track. I go through listening to it again, and I label with color. I'll label each good quote, and in my mind, or you can write it down, I've got a color associated with each topic. So it's like this person's origin story, I'm going to label that yellow. This person's challenges that they've overcome in life, I'm going to label this stuff green. And then I do this for all of my interviews so that when I want to arrange just the story, I can quickly look at the clips, look at the color, and I'm like, okay, I know if it's yellow, I know we're talking about origin stories of someone, how they got to be where they are today, and I can group them together easily, and it speeds it along. But basically, I always start with the interviews, and then I lay out my interviews once I've got the order that I think the story is going to be, I just put all the interviews out before dealing with B-roll at all. Then I go in after the fact and start adding in the B-roll that will match with what's being said, and or supplement it, or provide more emotional depth to what's being said. But I always start with the interviews. Another question, is there a certain order for the equipment setup before action? I don't think there's necessarily an order, but what I do personally, I guess maybe there is an order. So usually the first thing I do is I set up the camera, turn it on with the lens that I'm going to be using, so I see what we're dealing with in the room for lighting. Most situations, if we're inside, I want to turn off whatever interior lights they've got, because majority of the time it's someone's nasty fluorescent lights that look green and garbagey on camera. So I'll turn them off and set up our own lights. Like we're using like LED panels with some soft boxes or diffusion, and try to get that neutral but somewhat cinematic look I was talking about earlier, of like a 45-degree angle and a bit of hair separation light, which I've got a bit going on right now. So I'll turn off any interior lights to get that thing. And it also, I find that if you have the subject a bit brighter than their background, it kind of makes it more interesting and separates them from the background. If you're outside, you don't need to set up lights necessarily, but maybe you want to use a reflector so that the subject is lit evenly, or a big diffusion so they don't have harsh shadows under the sun. But so for me, it goes camera, lights, audio, action. That's how I get it all set up. Can you recommend script writing software is another question. I don't actually, I'm kind of lazy. I don't do the proper way, which is using script writing software. I just rely on Google Docs, because my wife and I do most of our productions together, and we like to be able to live edit or watch what the other person's typing and kind of add comments. And Google Docs is free, so that's what I use. But I think the Film Co-op, if you're looking for specific script writing software, I know the Film Co-op probably has a list of resources, even ones that are free for script writing. I've heard of them before, but I just end up, yeah, so Kat just said that she's going to send them some of those. So yeah, I just rely on Google Docs. Any other questions? Is there any questions that someone asked in the chat that I didn't fully answer that they want more info on, or anything like that? We still have 50.
Sorry, one more question.
Oh.
Have you ever worked with illustrators or motion graphic artists to complement the documentary? How do you go about like finding those people or creating the vision for them? Do you storyboard for them, or?
That's the funny thing. So through necessity, I learned how to do my own animation and that kind of thing. I'm not a graphic designer or illustrator myself, but I know how to animate any existing assets. So when we did Bureaucracy, we hired a friend of ours who's a graphic designer, and basically said, like, I would just draw poorly drawn out on a piece of paper, like, this is what we want like the logo to look like, or this is what we want this map to look like, or provide examples of something you see that has a similar look, and say, can you make us this? And for me, because I was going to animate myself, I'm like, can you give it to me in my like a Photoshop file or whatever, where the layers are separate? And it's pretty easy for them to do usually. And then I animate everything myself for the most part. And yeah, it works that way. So it can be pretty easy. And like, I just knew a graphic designer because we worked together when I worked at a video production company. But there's tons of graphic designers. There's probably a bunch that are Film Co-op members as well that you could probably connect to. And yeah, and then same goes for people who animate. You could find animators that way, or there's a lot of Facebook groups. There's one that I find super helpful and useful called I Need a Fixer / Producer Canada Edition or something like that. It's a private group. You have to request to join, but every day, multiple times a day, people are posting looking for a videographer in this town to shoot this, or looking for an animator. Or I posted once, I was like looking for recommendations of networks that might want to license a show about beer and that kind of stuff. So there's always cool questions and answers, and you can connect to people really well that way. But you just always have to be clear on if you're going to be paying them or not, like if you're asking for someone to volunteer their time or not. Oh, and Kat posted in the chat that Celtx, CELTX, is a great, I think that's a free script writing software. That's the one that I remember hearing of before. So someone just asked, do you have any recommendation for doc length? Is it something you discuss in advance? So there's a few answers. I would say, and someone else, Brenda Malley, says she uses Final Draft for script writing. Thank you. But so for documentary length, there's the mindset of you want to be able to tell your story and take as much time as you need. There's also the mindset of if you want someone to be able to sit through something for a certain length of time, and the approach of I want to be able to license this out or have it appear in festivals. If you want it to be licensed out or appearing in festivals, then you probably will have to keep a length in mind of keep in mind like what normal TV lengths are, like a half hour or 1 hour or an hour and a half with commercial breaks and all that. So for us, Bureaucracy was 75 minutes, which counts as a feature length documentary. And we were just kind of looking at on Film Freeway, different festivals, what they would accept for feature length categories. And we settled on 75 minutes. And so we did decide that not necessarily like at the very beginning, but as we were filming and throughout the process, we were kind of like, okay, we're going to aim for 75 minutes. And then we were editing. Usually your first draft is going to be longer than you aim for anyway, and you're going to have to keep trimming it down in later revisions. But we're like, keep 75 minutes in mind, and that's helpful. But it doesn't need to be a feature length doc. There's amazing docs that are only 10 minutes long or even shorter. Like the short docs that we did for CBC, I think they were just like 3 to 5 minutes. But it depends on what you want to do with it. Like if you're just going to put it up on the web and because you're doing it as a passion project, then it can be whatever length you want, but still keep in mind that you want people to watch the whole thing. So maybe don't make a 2 or 3 hour documentary, or you could always split it up. So I guess I should have mentioned that when Bell licensed Bureaucracy, which was a 75-minute documentary, they're like, can you cut it into 4 parts, which was just, we had natural points that were easy to cut. They're like, we think that viewers these days are much more likely, and I kind of agree, they're more likely to binge a few episodes of a show than to sit down and be like, I'm going to commit the next 75 minutes to watching a movie. So they put it up as like a 4-part series, even though it was the entire doc, it was just chopped into 4 15-minute episodes. So if it's really long, you could do it that way, but there's different ways you can approach it. It's a great question. Thank you. Any other questions? Still have 10 minutes, so I'm happy to answer whatever it is you want to know.
What are some of the challenges that you have come across during film production with documentaries and whatnot, like in terms of interviewing and equipment setup? Have you had any equipment failures? And if you have, how have you overcome those challenges? That's
a great question, because there's always challenges, and I've made lots of mistakes, and that's how I've learned. So I'll run through a whole bunch of challenges as they pop up in my head. So one of them is really bad sound that's just in the atmosphere of the room or whatever, especially when you're filming at breweries. There's always tons of equipment going on, but even if it's not a brewery, if it's just somewhere where there's like an uncontrollable air conditioner that's built into the room that you can't turn off or something like that. So that goes back to sound being very important. And usually, I should have mentioned that as you're setting up the area you're going to be filming in, you're setting up your lights and everything, you should be listening for, are there any weird noises? So you put on your headphones before you film. I usually get the person to, if I hit record, I'll be like, can you say and spell your name for me? That helps you in 2 ways. One of them is you make sure you have the correct spelling of the person's name. The other way is that you hear audio levels. So like, do I need to increase my levels because they're quiet, or are they really loud and I turn them down? Are there any other weird noises going on? So sound is usually a challenge. Another challenge when filming outside or near a window is the moving sun, the light, or if there's clouds that keep moving on and off as your lighting and exposure will keep changing. So that's why personally I find it helpful. Like my wife and I work together on all the stuff. We've got 2 people. So she'll usually do the interviewing, and then I can just focus on staring at the multiple cameras and making sure that everything's fine. Because the subject, maybe if you're using a very narrow focus, they're kind of leaning forward while they're talking and you frame the shot. And then suddenly they lean back in their chair and they're completely out of focus. Or if you were using a boom mic, their voice is suddenly way quieter. So those are like stuff that you can't account for that are going to happen in the moment, and you need to notice them. And so and especially even challenging if you're filming completely on your own, which you can totally do. When I was in university and I was doing an interview, I was interviewing the person, I was sitting right next to the camera that I'd framed up. And then after I did the interview and they walked away, I looked at the camera and the tripod wasn't tight enough, the tripod wasn't tight enough. So it had slowly drooped down the whole interview. So by the end, it was just a shot staring at the person's feet. And I was like, oh, great. And what I did, luckily it was a student assignment. So to cover it up, I still had the audio, which was fine. So I just took a picture of the person, had that on screen, and then had like text on screen over that along with the audio and the little audio waveform effect. And it worked out. No one really knew because CBC does that all the time in news stories. So no one knew, but I was like, luckily I had good audio, if not video. So there's always challenges like that, or, people walking by with the shot, camera, depending on what camera you're using, it might have like a 30-minute record limit. So you have to check if you know that's happening, maybe set a timer on your phone. Remember that at 30 minutes, you got to hit record again. So technical equipment problems can happen all the time, which is why it's good to have backups. And then nature and uncontrollable problems can happen, but that's also partly the fun of filmmaking, and just being flexible and seeing what happens in the moment. And it can sometimes lead to some things that are usable, like if you can end up having the subject laughing and getting some cool shots of people interacting where they're suddenly taken out of their stressful, I'm being interviewed, and just genuine and reacting to what's going on. You can get some great material that way, or it can help you continue from there and get some natural, more chilled out responses from it. That's a great question. Anyone else have any questions?
Do you ever work on anything like product demos, including possibly, some use dramatizations to show the value of something, and how do you factor in the documentary approach to that?
That's a great question. So it's funny because I do like product demos, like I do a lot of corporate video freelance here and there. But in terms of like within a documentary context and dramatizations, I think a lot of you, especially if you've noticed with like true crime documentaries and that kind of thing, or TV shows, they will, and CBC has to do this, but they will say dramatization on the screen, like in small white lettering at the bottom. And that's part of being unbiased and being honest with your viewer. And it's totally fine to do if you need to do it. Because if it's going to help tell the story or be more impactful because someone's talking about some crazy event that happened, then totally you can use actors and film it as you would any film and get some cool angles. But it's important that you make it clear to the viewer that it is a dramatization. So that could be as easy as just putting those words down at the bottom of the screen or something like that. But yeah, that's another very useful tool, especially if you're interviewing someone about some event that happened a long time ago. Obviously, you're not necessarily going to be able to get footage in the moment of that event because it was in the past. So that's where you might need to rely on dramatizations in order to tell that. I love using archival photos for multiple reasons. They look cool, they can show what happened in the past. And if they're old enough, they're in public domain, so they're free use and you don't need to pay for them or anything like that. So you'd want to look into your Creative Commons laws before using anything like that. But yeah, totally, whatever you can do. So it's 5 minutes left, and I'm happy to stay here another 5 minutes if anyone has any more questions, because these have been some great questions so far.
Alex?
Yeah.
Quick question from me. have you ever run, well, I know you have, but I'll just ask this question. Just running into issues where, let's say you're hired to shoot an event, and of course there are people there, um, and you're just getting crowd shots, and it's for this promo piece you're doing for the company. Let's say it's a craft beer place or whatever. How do you deal with difficult people just like basically saying you can't shoot me, or like what, I guess, how do you diplomatically handle things like that? Does it happen a lot?
I'm glad you asked. That's yeah, because that has happened to me, and it happens to a lot of people many times. So there's a few different factors that can go into this. So if you're filming an event, do you have permission from the people that are running the event? If so, which you probably should get, what you need to do is set up a notice at the entrances to the event that says, please be aware this event is being recorded. Here's what it's for. Here's our contact information. If you're doing this, like if maybe you're hired by the event people to film the event, then it's on them, not really on you, because they're the ones that have hired you to film it. So, but you still want to have those signs up, and you could say like, contact the event owner if you don't want to be in it. If someone comes up to you and you've got your camera and they're like, I don't want to be filmed, then I just say, sure, no problem, and I'll agree with them. The challenge can be, let's say you were filming a whole bunch, someone comes up to you after the fact and you're like, I don't want to be in your film and I don't want to be on camera, which has happened to me. Legally, if you're in a public space, you have no reasonable expectation of privacy. That's why sometimes you'll see like a news van or something parked on the street and they're filming from the street and not on a business property, because legally you can do whatever, you can film anything that you want on the street because no one has a reasonable expectation of privacy. So you can I would maybe not argue with the person, because I'm kind of a non-confrontational person, but I'll just be like, yeah, sure, like we'll, when we edit, we'll do our best not to include shots of you or something like that. But sometimes you run into people that just see a camera and they want to make a scene, which has happened to me before. And you just try to be as diplomatic as possible. And if they're really, like, I've been threatened to be sued before by people, and when that happens, you can be like, sure, yeah, just have your lawyer call me, and nothing has ever come of anything like that. But sometimes I'll just be like, look, you're in a public space. I have permission to be here from the person running the event. I usually will have if it's a small enough event, I'll have the person running it make an announcement like, hello, Alex and his wife are here filming, or there's a crew filming here. Obviously you can see the cameras over in the corner. If you don't want to be on camera, maybe like right now, give them a wave so they know not to get you in any shots, which is what we've done. And just try to be respectful of people who don't want to be on camera. But sometimes people are going to end up in a shot that didn't want to be in it. And if they're really adamant about it and they're emailing you, you can always blur their faces if you absolutely need the shot, or crop in or something like that. But I've been threatened to be sued and I've never been sued. So it's a good thing to keep in mind. Just try to be polite when it happens, and keep in mind some people just want to cause drama and it's not personal. So yeah.
Great answer. Thank you.
No problem. Probably time for one last question if anyone has one we can squeeze in.
So you mentioned that you've gone through a lot of editing softwares over the years. You mentioned Premiere Pro. What's the current editing software they're using right now, and are you satisfied with it? Or you like it? Like, have you gone through any challenges with it, is what my main question is.
Totally. I have a love-hate relationship with Premiere Pro, because when it works really well. I like that it's really fast. Like, you literally just drag your clips in with your mouse and drag it around and it works like that. But then half the time there's these, especially when you get into documentaries and you have lots of footage or it's getting longer, that's when Premiere becomes really unreliable and it'll crash, or there'll be random bugs, things will go wrong. And you look online and it's like been a problem since 2016 that Adobe hasn't fixed. And that's when I hate Premiere Pro. So, but you're gonna run into that no matter what software you use. So before that, I used an Avid Media Composer, which is what I learned at STU. And that's like the industry standard for any big news broadcaster around the world. And that's what probably most of Hollywood uses. And Avid is fantastic because it just works, but it's very expensive. And it can be kind of inflexible. So like, I haven't used it I haven't used the latest version recently. But it used to be that like any footage you brought in that wasn't just like a normal proper video camera, like bringing in GoPro footage just wouldn't work half the time, or anything, or phone footage. So I find that Premiere, despite its bugs, it works best for me. But if any of you are looking for free editing software, the one that I would recommend is DaVinci Resolve, and it's free, super powerful. I'd love to learn it if I can find the time, because that's what more and more people are using. And the biggest thing is that it's free and it can do anything Premiere can do. And it's free. So yeah, totally. Awesome.
Thank you.
So, my pleasure. Well, thanks all of you for joining. I hope you learned some stuff. And if you do have any questions that we weren't able to answer that you think of later, feel free to email Kat and she'll forward it along to me probably, or something like that. And yeah, thanks once again. Hope you all, if you're interested in making documentaries, that you learn some new stuff and go out there and film.